YouTube, Kennard Vernon Stewart here for the podcast. We're talking Auburn football. Go ahead and like the video, comment, subscribe to the channel, and as always, great to be an Auburn Tiger, War Eagle. So when we look at the 2020 football schedule, football season that's on the horizon, obviously, there's still some question as to whether the football season is actually going to take place, especially with some areas of the pandemic still increasing due to states opening back up. But that is a story or a subject for those who are a little bit more or have a little bit more areas of expertise than I do. But looking at this football season, Auburn has a very unique opportunity to be very successful. However, you look at Auburn's roster right now, you talk about some middle 4 stars, got a 5-star quarterback out of high school, Bo Nix. But still, Auburn has some challenges as far as just having an elite roster. And I think you have a lot of blue-collar guys that can really make some great things happen. But as far as like going into a football game, say against North Carolina, and just being able to out-talent that football team, Auburn is not quite there yet. And I think that's sometimes what gets the fan base so bogged down is the fact that when they look at Alabama and they look at, say, Georgia maybe or LSU, and they look at those teams' abilities to just go in and just straight up thrash some portions of Power 5 competition, whereas Auburn might go into that game and absolutely struggle, may have to pull it out in the end. That's because largely due to Auburn's recruiting and maybe, let's just put this out there, maybe a little bit of player development in there. But at the same time, it's pretty easy to develop a Devontae Smith, at Alabama. It's easy to develop a Terrence Marshall. It's easy to develop a Joe Burrow, who has a wealth of experience, played at Ohio State University, then transfers to LSU as a quarterback. It's easy to develop that. That will make anybody look good. It's easy to develop a Cam Newton. Cam Newton brings the tools to the table. But when you're in a situation where you're piecing together stuff like Will Hastings and, wide receivers like those, and asking these guys to pair up against some of the best secondary, some of the best defensive lines in the country, that's where the lines get a little blurred. And the expectations have to kind of reel themselves back in when you start to look at the reality of the situation. So that's why when you look at Auburn and you go into games like Minnesota, for example, I think Auburn, middle of the season, in the height of all things, I think Auburn has a relatively not easy time, but probably should beat Minnesota by, say, 2 touchdowns. But then you get in a situation in a bowl game, you got Derek Brown garnishing almost every possible award for a defensive lineman during that time. You're going into a 12 o'clock game, not to make excuses. Auburn should have been a little bit more prepared. But, at this point, after battling through the SEC, actually winning against Alabama this year, it's just a meaningless game. So looking at this particular schedule, it's kind of interesting. Auburn's got North Carolina right after what should be a warm-up game against Alcorn State out of the FCS. A team that has a pretty decent level of history in their particular genre of football, including one of the best quarterbacks in NFL history, the late Stephen Air McNair, playing at Alcorn State. Then the next week, taking on North Carolina, which I think right now is starting to become more of a pinpoint kind of game. I think it's starting to become one of those games where Auburn fans are like, the more I look at this thing, these guys are actually probably going to bring a little bit more to the table than expected. I think when you look at a team like North Carolina, very talented, very sneaky talented football team, and a team that you definitely want to keep your eyes on because, well, for number one, they just barely, probably a coaching decision away from actually beating Clemson last year. Now, Clemson, in my opinion, weren't as good as they were in subsequent years, but still have a very talented football team. And just in that particular game, just wasn't really expecting Clemson to have to go toe-to-toe with North Carolina in that particular football game. So you got to look out for North Carolina. That's probably one of the more scary games on Auburn's particular schedule to begin the season with. And one thing Gus Malzahn, as head coach, who seems to be getting a little bit more comfortable as Auburn's football coach, he hasn't had that year yet that past coaches for Auburn has had. And the Auburn fan base, at least some genres of the Auburn fan base, will not give, say, certain areas of credit with Gus Malzahn where credit is due. Largely, especially if you speak publicly about this, you're going to be called a sunshine pumper and blah, all that kind of stuff. So a lot of the guys that really, kind of have at least a level of empathy or at least some, maybe lower level of support for Gus Malzahn usually stay kind of quiet. Now, back to the subject. On facing North Carolina, one thing Gus Malzahn does not want to do going into this season is actually start this season out 1-1. For one thing, you beat a FCS school, then you lose to a Power 5 school, then all of a sudden the hot seat talk start again, and that's not something that you want going into the portion of your season that includes some real interesting matchups in the SEC, including Ole Miss, with Mike Leach being there, the air raid offense back in effect. Auburn is probably going to be tested. They're already looking at this. Auburn is going to be tested in the secondary. Yes, you have Christian Tutt coming back. Yes, you have Smoke Monday. Yes, you have Jamie Sherwood. And you have Roger McCreary. But who is Roger McCreary going to switch over to the field cornerback? And maybe Marco DeMio starts out at the boundary. Who knows? Those are the questions that these guys are going to get tested early, and that's going to be a perceived weak spot for the Auburn Tigers. Also, you continue to go down the stretch. You got a game against Kentucky. That's not always an easy game for the Auburn Tigers. So this could be a very tricky, although it looks attractive because you don't have Oregon as your number one, as the team that you're going to actually start the season off with. But it's still a very tricky schedule to where if some things, especially when you look at the Auburn roster, if some things don't go Auburn's way, they could really be looking at some challenges early on and having to really, looking back at the 2017 year where Auburn started out a little slow and then had to make an epic run for the rest of the season. And I just don't think, from a level of comfortability, I don't think Gus Malzahn wants to put his team in that position, especially unnecessarily. You gotta beat North Carolina. You've recruited better than them. You have probably a much, I'm not going to say a much better roster, but you have a more talented roster. You got to beat a team like North Carolina. You can't struggle with teams like that especially when you have, so many higher level football teams that you have to play later on in the season. You got Georgia, you got LSU, you got Alabama, you got Texas A&M, who's starting to recruit well and to play very well. Especially impressive with Texas A&M and their ability to have recruited on the defensive line. They've really stepped their game up when it comes to that. Because you think about Texas A&M, when they first arrived to the SEC back in 2012, defense wasn't their forte. But now it's becoming more difficult each year for teams to move the football on Texas. So that's a game that you have to circle on your calendar that could be a possible gauntlet for the Tigers as they move down the stretch, especially coming off, playing that game around either before or after they play Georgia. No, actually that game is after they play Georgia, after Auburn plays Georgia. And, it's not going to be easy. You talk about the week right after you play Georgia. You play Georgia on the road against Athens. Let's just say by chance Auburn beats Georgia. You got to avoid the letdown coming into Texas A&M because you're going to have to rev right back up. Although a home game, hopefully a night home game against Texas A&M. And then to finish off the stretch with Mississippi State, who probably will be at least a decent football team. I don't think this is a game that Auburn should really concern themselves necessarily from a roster standpoint, from a player development standpoint, as a game that scares you. But you still definitely want to be obviously prepared for a game like this because there's still some talented football players down there. and some players that can really push the envelope, especially if you go into a game like this on the road. You have some turnovers early. You have some costly penalties, which I talked about before, and those will be the great equalizers in a game against a team like Mississippi State or maybe even Arkansas, which I think Auburn should steamroll right through Arkansas. Now, LSU and Alabama, we're gonna do some in-depth coverage on those games, especially as the season develops. Of course, LSU is in a position to where Joe Burrow, quarterback, is gone, and the passing game coordinator Joe Brady is gone. So you're gonna be looking at some new levels, possibly philosophy wise, with the offense. But still, LSU keeps a very, very talented football team down there. And last but not least, you talk about the end game against Alabama. Gus Malzahn has not won on the road in the Iron Bowl since being a head coach. He actually won as an offensive coordinator via the comeback back in 2010, that national championship run for the Auburn Tigers, but have not won against Alabama in Bryant-Denny Stadium as a head coach. As a matter of fact, came close in 2014, but pretty much have been double-digit losses for the Tigers. And then you talk about postseason. This is something that Gus Malzahn is just going to have to get better at, motivating his players to do well in the postseason. Because if you look at the schedule you look at the last year's results from a perception standpoint, a 10-3 season just on paper looks way better than 9-4. You talk about a double-digit win season. You talk about beating one of the hottest teams in the Big Ten at one point of the season in Minnesota, which would have been a huge opportunity for the Tigers from a perception standpoint. Now, Auburn still finished up in 2019, 2020's recruiting class, signing most of the guys on signing day, and I think that was a huge deal for the Auburn Tigers. All right, guys, this was just a real glimpse of kind of a picture of what Auburn has ahead with this particular football season. I think, you have to scale back the expectation a little bit. You still have offensive linemen who have not proven themselves. You still have a very inexperienced but talented backfield. Don't know how the wide receiver position is going to crystallize because you have a lot of potential talent there, especially coming from the 2020 recruiting class, and also with the return of Seth Williams, Anthony Swartz, and possibly Eli Stove, could be a pretty good position group. All right, guys, this is all I got for right now. Maybe until tomorrow, we'll come back and talk a little bit more about Auburn football. Go ahead and leave your comments down in the comment section. I always enjoy reading those. As a matter of fact, this particular video was actually inspired by a comment in the comment section. Don't remember specifically, but it talked about, Auburn, possibly going 10-2. And then you had some more comments where Auburn is looking at 8-4. And when I really started to dissect the schedule, just looking at this schedule and thinking Auburn is just going to go 12-0, I think that's a very naive way of looking at this schedule. Going back to Alabama even, Najee Harris, running back, probably is poised to have a very huge season. Could possibly be a Heisman contender. This is a good football player. And so Alabama is going to come into this season very talented, as always. But anyway, that's enough for now. Want to give a big shout out to all the Auburn fans out there, the fearless and true gang. And as always, it's great to be an Auburn Tiger, War Eagle.